We don't try to arrest it. We don't try to slap handcuffs on a Category 5 storm.
Right, you can't exactly negotiate with the weather.
Exactly. We board up the windows, we evacuate, and we just accept that nature is going to do what nature is going to do. You respect its power, or you get destroyed by it. But what happens when you give that kind of unstoppable, terrifying force of nature teeth? When you give it a mind, a memory, and a literal destiny to end the world?
Well, then you get a very different kind of storm. You get a monster that is both a biological impossibility and a really profound psychological tragedy. You get a creature that basically forces us to look at how we try to control the uncontrollable.
Right, and that's exactly what we're looking at today. Welcome to this deep dive. Today, our mission is to unpack a massive stack of sources. We're talking academic databases, Reddit threads, dark fantasy biology essays, to look at the ultimate apocalyptic storm. We are diving deep into Fenrir.
The colossal, world-ending wolf of Norse mythology.
Yeah. But for everyone listening, we aren't just going to recap some ancient campfire story here. We want to actually deconstruct the theoretical biology of an impossible superpredator. We're going to break down the psychology of a self-fulfilling prophecy and figure out how a 1,000-year-old wolf still absolutely dominates our pop culture today, from Marvel to God of War.
Because Fenrir, I mean, he isn't just a relic. He's the perfect lens for examining how ancient humans process the terrifying randomness of their environment, and how we, centuries later, still use that exact same mythological framework to process very modern themes of trauma, isolation, and rebellion.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Because looking at his family tree and how his story starts, there was this one Reddit comment in our sources that I thought was perfect. They compared Fenrir to the ultimate misunderstood high schooler.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. He's like that kid who gets a bad reputation based purely on his chaotic family, gets judged on his intimidating appearance, gets aggressively bullied by the authorities, and eventually just he leans into the bad guy role because that is literally all anyone expects of him.
Yeah, and that is actually a surprisingly accurate parallel to how the foundational texts of Norse mythology describe his upbringing. So if we look at the 13th century manuscripts, the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda Fenrir is born into a deeply problematic family.
Yeah, to say the least.
Right. His father is a trickster god, Loki, and his mother is a giantess named Angrboða. Yeah, he's part of this terrifying sibling trio. So you've got his brother Jörmungandr, the World Serpent, and his sister Hel, who goes on to rule the realm of the dead.
So, Odin and the rest of the Norse gods look at these three kids and just immediately panic. They decide they need to neutralize the threat before it even starts. So Odin throws the serpent into the depths of the ocean. He casts Hel down into the underworld. But, and this is where it gets weird, for some inexplicable reason, they bring Fenrir, who is just a little wolf cub at this point, home to Asgard to raise him.
It's an incredible display of arrogance.
Why would they do that?
I mean, they genuinely believe they can tame the chaos. But they quickly realize their mistake. Because Fenrir grows at this completely unnatural, terrifying rate. He's so aggressive and so physically imposing right from the jump that out of all the powerful, battle-hardened Norse gods, only one of them has the courage to even approach him.
Right, the god Tyr.
Exactly. Tyr is the only one brave enough to feed him.
And while Tyr is, throwing him steaks or whatever, the rest of the gods are basically doing the math. They're watching this wolf get bigger every single day, and they're remembering the prophecies that say this exact creature is fated to literally eat Odin and end their world. So they decide, okay, we have to put him in chains, but they don't just attack him, which is so messed up, they manipulate him.
Yeah, it's all about deception.
They bring out this massive chain called lading, and they frame it as a game of strength. Like, hey, buddy, prove how tough you are by letting us chain you up so you can break out.
And Fenrir, evaluates the chain, realizes absolutely nothing to him, and snaps it effortlessly. So the gods are now sweating a bit. They forge a second chain called Dromi, which is twice as thick. And again, they play the exact same game.
And again, Fenrir shatters it into a million pieces. The imagery here is so intense that this moment actually birthed a colloquial saying among the ancient Norse.
Right, the phrase they used.
Yeah. When someone achieved something that required this, absolutely monumental, exhausting effort, they'd say they had loosed from leading or struck out of Dromi.
Which is fascinating, but for the gods in that moment, it is just sheer terror. Because normal iron, even divine iron forged by gods, simply does not work. Brute force has failed entirely. So Odin sends a messenger to the subterranean dwarves to forge something conceptually impossible.
And this is the third restraint, Gleipnir.
Exactly. And the materials required for this aren't physical metals. There's 6 abstract concepts: the sound of a cat's footfalls, a woman's beard, the roots of a mountain, the breath of a fish, the spit of a bird, and the sinew of a bear.
Which, I mean, on the surface, that sounds completely absurd, like fish breath.
Right, it sounds like nonsense.
But when you really think about the underlying logic, it makes perfect sense. If physical strength has a mathematical limit, and Fenrir keeps easily surpassing that limit, well, you can't use physical objects to hold him anymore. You have to bind him with the weight of the impossible. You have to anchor a creature of infinite growth with things that simply do not exist in reality.
That's exactly it. It's conceptual magic. And the deception here is that Gleipnir doesn't look like a heavy iron chain. It just looks like a soft, silky ribbon. So the gods take Fenrir out to an isolated island, and they pull the same trick. Oh, hey, try to break this silk ribbon.
But Fenrir isn't just a dumb animal. He's highly intelligent. He looks at this tiny ribbon, he looks at the nervous gods, and he realizes it's a trap. So he refuses unless one of the gods places their hand inside his mouth as a pledge of good faith. Like, if this is a trick, you lose the hand.
And suddenly nobody wants to play the game. They all just stare at their shoes.
Yeah, crickets.
Right, until finally, Tyr, the only god who ever showed him a shred of kindness, the one who fed him, steps forward and puts his right hand into the jaws of the wolf.
And so the ribbon is tied, Fenrir struggles, and the more he fights, the tighter the conceptual magic of Gleipnir becomes. He realizes he has been entirely betrayed, and he bites Tyr's hand clean off at the wrist, which the texts brutally refer to as the wolf joint.
Yeah, it's incredibly visceral.
And the cruelty doesn't even stop there. Once they realize he is securely bound, they take the cord attached to the ribbon called gelja, and they run it through a massive stone slab called giol, burying it deep in the earth. Then they peg it down with an even larger boulder called thviti. And when Fenrir predictably thrashes around and tries to bite his abusers, they shove a sword into his mouth. The hilt rests on his lower jaw, the point stabs into his upper jaw, propping his mouth permanently open, and he drools in such agony that his saliva forms an entire river, a river called Van, which, ironically, tragically, translates to hope.
It is a harrowing image of torture. And, it raises a glaring question about the god's strategy here.
It really does, because it's like trying to put a reinforced steel muzzle on a rapidly growing puppy, deceiving it, and then acting shocked when it bites you. And honestly, if the gods knew with absolute certainty that this wolf was destined to kill Odin at Ragnarok, and they already have him pinned down with a sword in his mouth, why not just execute him right then and there? Why go through this elaborate, permanent torture?
Because the gods are trapped by their own bureaucracy of reference.
Wait, what do you mean?
Well, the Norse worldview placed an immense, unyielding importance on designated holy places and places of sanctuary. The text explicitly states that the gods respected their sanctuaries too much to defile them with the wolf's blood.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, their hands were tied by their own arbitrary rules. What's fascinating here is that they chose a temporary, agonizing restraint over a permanent solution, which absolutely guarantees their eventual catastrophic doom.
That is just wow. So if divine dwarf-forged iron shatters like glass against his neck and normal biology can't explain him, we kind of have to stop looking at Fenrir as an overgrown animal. We have to start asking what kind of impossible biological engine is actually powering him. We're moving out of ancient myth and into the realm of, like, speculative, dark fantasy biology.
It's a necessary shift to comprehend the sheer scale we are dealing with here. Because to support the mythological descriptions of Fenrir, normal biology completely fails. I mean, by the time we reach Ragnarok, the texts describe him running with his lower jaw scraping the earth while his upper jaw is literally scraping the sky.
Which is insane. If you scale a wolf up to even a fraction of that size, the square cube law of physics dictates that the creature would instantly collapse under its own massive weight.
Exactly. His bones would just crush themselves.
Yeah, right. So biologically, to exist at that scale, he would need an impossibly reinforced skeletal structure.
Yeah.
We are talking about bone density resembling solid titanium or some kind of rune-infused calcification. And the musculature required to snap divine chains and support jaws that size. It would have to be explosive, fast-twitch muscle fibers combined with terrifying mechanical leverage in his neck.
And then consider the mechanics of his metabolism. A biological predator of that size would need to consume entire pods of whales or entire coastal villages just to sustain its basic daily caloric needs.
But Fenrir's hunger isn't biological, right? It's cosmic.
Yeah.
Symbolically, he operates on a supernatural metabolism that feeds on chaos, on fear, and on the collapse of order itself.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. Imagine you're playing a dark fantasy RPG, and Fenrir is the final boss. How do you actually fight a creature with jaws the size of a mountain range?
Yeah.
Like mathematically, strategically, what is the play? You can't. If you try to strategize against that physically, strength is entirely irrelevant.
Right, you couldn't even scratch him. Normal weapons are useless. You don't fight him by swinging a sword and depleting his HP.
No, the only counter to an impossible super predator like Fenrir is conceptual magic and psychological warfare. In dark fantasy RPG terms, you don't fight him physically. It's an encounter built entirely on environmental hazards, manipulating reality itself like Gleipnir and just trying to survive long enough to bind him. Because if he gets close enough to initiate a physical attack, the fight is already over.
So his defining biological trait is endless scaling. He is living entropy with absolutely no natural limit to his growth. But we can't forget that he isn't just a biological killing machine.
Right, he's sapient.
Yeah, he talks. He understands the nuances of deception and honor and negotiations, which is exactly why he demanded Tyr's hand.
Which turns the mechanics of a monster hunt into a profound psychological thriller. Fenrir is not a mindless beast acting on pure predatory instinct, and this is crucial. He only turns violently hostile against Asgard after the gods betray him.
Exactly. He was born into a destiny where literally nobody trusted him. The gods looked at a growing cub and saw only their own death. It feels so much like the premise of the movie Minority Report.
Oh, that's a perfect comparison.
Right. You arrest someone for a future crime they haven't committed yet, but the very act of arresting them, the act of torturing and binding them, ends up being the exact catalyst that provides the motive for the crime to happen in the first place. So what does this all mean? Like, is Fenrir actually this grand evil villain? Or is he just a tragic victim of circumstances reacting exactly how anyone would react to eternal torture?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it requires us to abandon our modern desire for a good versus evil binary. Norse mythology simply doesn't operate that way.
Right, they're much more gray.
Exactly. The gods are deeply flawed. They lie, they break their sacred oaths, they act out of sheer terror and selfishness. Fenrir isn't a cartoon villain twirling his mustache. He functions as a natural disaster. He's an earthquake. He is driven by the absolute inevitability of fate. And there's actually a brilliant real-world biological link to this. Ethologist Valerius Geist, a scientist who studies animal behavior, points out that wolves are genetically encoded to constantly challenge and rise in the pack hierarchy. In the wild, wolves have been known to violently rebel against and even kill their parents.
So the gods bring him into their pack, raise him, and then suddenly betray him. Of course, he's going to violently challenge the alpha, which in this case is Odin.
Exactly. The real tragedy is that the gods' fear manifested their own destruction.
And that inevitability brings us to the climax of the myth, Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. And it's incredible how this specific apocalyptic image of a giant wolf was carved into the bedrock of ancient history, and how it continues to completely dominate modern pop culture today.
Yeah, so the mythology tells us that at the onset of Ragnarok, a massive cosmic earthquake will finally shatter the impossible bonds of Gleipnir. Fenrir breaks loose, and he marches toward the great battlefield of Vigrid, which is this plain that stretches 100 leagues in every direction, designed to hold the final clash of cosmic forces.
The descriptions are just terrifying.
They really are. He approaches with fire burning from his eyes and his nostrils, his massive jaws stretched from the earth to the heavens. And on that battlefield, he fulfills his destiny. He swallows Odin, the Allfather, completely whole.
But the gods aren't completely unprepared, right? Odin has a counter-strategy in his son, Vidar. And Vidar is fascinating because he is the polar opposite of Fenrir's chaotic noise and infinite growth. Vidar represents silence, extreme patience, and meticulous preparation. He wears a magical shoe that has been crafted over centuries from all the leftover leather scraps of every shoe ever made by humanity.
It's another brilliant use of conceptual magic, just like Gleipnir.
Right. So he steps on Fenrir's lower jaw with this impossibly thick shoe made from the mundane, everyday preparations of mankind. Then he grabs the wolf's upper jaw, and using pure strength, he literally rips Fenrir's mouth apart, killing the unkillable predator.
And this imagery, the giant wolf devouring the divine ruler only to be torn apart, was so potent and deeply terrifying to the ancient Norse that we find it carved into stone monuments dating back to the 10th and 11th century.
Really? Like actual archaeological stones?
Oh yeah. If you look at archaeological finds like Thorwald's Cross on the Isle of Man, or the Gosforth Cross in England, or the Ledberg Stone in Sweden, Fenrir is prominently featured.
And what's amazing about those specific stones is that they are prime examples of syncretic art. You have these ancient cultures experiencing a massive religious shift, newly converting to Christianity, and they use the visual language they already know to process the new theology they're being taught.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They blended the pagan imagery of Ragnarok with the newly arriving Christian imagery of the Book of Revelation and Judgment Day. Early Christians looked at the carving of Vidar, tearing apart the jaws of a giant wolf, and said, yes, that perfectly represents Christ defeating Satan.
That's wild.
The visual of a cosmic devourer is such a deeply embedded human fear that it transcends specific religions. There are even proposed parallels to ancient Persian mythology, where the demon Ahriman swallows the ruler Taxmaro in a very, very similar fashion.
And we really haven't shaken that primal fear, have we? We just project it onto new screens. Modern media still heavily utilizes Fenrir, but it tends to split his personality right down the middle depending on what kind of story the creators want to tell.
Yeah, that's true.
Like, look at Marvel's movie Thor, Ragnarok. In that film, Fenrir is portrayed purely as a monstrous biological threat. He's a giant, undead, brutal battlefield beast. It's all about visual spectacle, intimidation, and raw power.
Conversely, if you look at the recent video game God of War Ragnarok, the writers leaned heavily into the psychological tragedy of the myth. They focused on themes of loyalty, profound sorrow, and victimhood, really showing the emotional toll of a creature forced into a monstrous role.
Yeah, that game broke my heart a little bit.
It really did.
Yeah.
And Fenrir is also a massive, enduring influence in heavy metal music, which thrives on that doom-laden aesthetic, and in Japanese RPGs like Final Fantasy and Persona, where he often appears not as a villain, but as an ancient, majestic guardian.
Which makes you step back and wonder, out of all the mythological creatures humanity has dreamt up, dragons, chimeras, sea serpents, minotaurs, why are we, in the modern day, still so deeply obsessed with a giant wolf?
Well, this raises an important question about our own psychology. Modern audiences deeply resonate with the archetype of the misunderstood outcast. We understand, now more than ever, the idea of unhealed trauma being transformed into destructive, uncontrollable rage.
Absolutely.
Fenrir endures because he's a perfect, seamless combination. He represents that primal, biological fear of the wolf waiting in the dark woods, scaled up to a cosmic, world-ending level, but all wrapped in a profound psychological tragedy of betrayal.
It is the ultimate, heartbreaking story of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And as a listener, it leaves you with something very real to think about in your own life. Think about the last time you encountered a monster, whether that's a difficult person, a marginalized group, or just a terrifying unknown situation in society. Do we approach the unknown with empathy and a genuine willingness to understand? Or do we immediately bind it in chains of fear, isolate it, torture it, and ultimately create the exact destruction we were trying so desperately to avoid?
It is a heavy reflection on human nature, but there is one final, incredibly beautiful detail hidden in the ancient texts,
Right.
specifically a poem called Vafthrudismal, that shifts this entirely.
Oh.
Yeah, during the chaos of Ragnarok, when Fenrir, or in some versions his offspring, finally leaps into the sky and attacks the sun, plunging the entire universe into absolute freezing darkness.
Oh.
Right before the sun is devoured, she bears a daughter.
Wait, really? The sun has a daughter right at the end of the world?
Yes. And the poem promises that after the apocalypse, after the fires burn out and the smoke clears, that daughter will take up her mother's path. She will continue to shine, tracing the exact same route through the newly reborn heavens. It suggests that Fenrir's apocalyptic chaos isn't just a final, depressing end. The devastation is the necessary, violent clearing of the old, broken, corrupt world, making way for a resilient, beautiful new light.
Wow. Which brings us right back to the hurricane. You can't chain the storm, you can't negotiate with the disaster, and sometimes it sweeps away everything you thought was permanent. But when the winds finally die down and the clouds clear, you aren't just left with ruins. You are standing at the ground zero of a new beginning.